Says a lot.
I have work one, and then one of the kids. Okay, so one of the kids, he lives like right next to me.
So I can unmute.
And
You can unmute and you can hear it in those
and
cans.
his soccer game on Friday. It's his last soccer game.
Can you probably can hear the microphone?
It's his last soccer game, and I'm gonna do it because he's been asking me, and I. It probably won't. Well, I was gonna go like the right. She did last. say this every single week, but it's a good reminder for even me and everyone up here, just to remember that being here, just like in this building, is such a privilege. Like being able to like tell people about the gospel and even say Jesus' name is such a privilege for us. And there's so many people who don't get that opportunity. And so don't take this for advantage. And just like, don't worry about the person next to you. Don't worry about how they're singing or how you're singing. Just like give all the glory and praise to God. Because that's the reason why we're here. We're not here for the person next to us or to see how good we sound. We're here for the Lord, and that's it. So, in Scripture it says, in everything you do for the glory of God. So, that goes a lot in worship. Everything that we do in worship is all for the glory of God. It's not for show. I remember when I was
worship you to the best abilities. And all this I pray. Amen. Just one word, you calm the storm that surrounds. Just one word, the darkness has to retreat. Just one touch, I feel the presence of heaven. Just one touch, my eyes are open to see. My heart can't help but believe. There's nothing that our God can't do. There's not a mountain that He can't move. We praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing that our God can't do. Just one word, you heal us broken inside. Just one word, and you live out that just one touch, I feel the power of heaven. Just one touch, my eyes are open to see. My heart can't help but believe. There's nothing that our God can't do. There's not a mountain that He can't move. We praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing that our God can't do. There's nothing that our God can't do. There's not a prison wall He can't break through. We praise the name who makes a way. There's nothing that our God can't do. I will believe for greater things. There's no power like the power of Jesus. Let faith arise, let all agree. There's no power like the power of Jesus. I will believe for greater things. There's no power like the power of Jesus. Let faith arise, let all agree. There's no power like the power of Jesus. I will believe for greater things. There's no power
this presence with us. I just pray that you'll speak through us as we go into this next time of prayer. And I just pray that you'll just speak through us and that you'll just answer our prayers, Lord, as they need to be answered. And have your will be done. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
Was it not necessary that the Messiah must suffer these things and enter into his glory?
All right. It's good to see you. Hey, turn me down it's probably my gain. If you select my channel and turn my gain down some, and then you can turn my channel back up some. It's good to see you tonight. Before we begin, just a quick, I know he left, but Roberto, who is playing the drums, he's been working real hard over the last couple weeks to get us back up and going with the streaming to Facebook and YouTube, and he finally got it today after a lot of trouble, so very appreciative of him. So tonight, we are continuing the series that we started 2 weeks ago. Remember last week we were at the Blessing of the Youth, so we didn't have a message, but 2 weeks ago, we started a new series called King of Kings. And in this series, we're beginning to talk about how we are looking at the three prominent kings of the Old Testament. Can anyone remember who the three prominent kings are that we said are in the Old Testament? Yeah. Saul, David, and Solomon. That's right. And so we are looking at the lives that they lived, the kingships that they had, and we're looking at how they compare to Jesus. Because Jesus, throughout Scripture, in the Old and New Testament, is related to as the King of Kings. And we're talking about how if someone is to be the King of Kings, that means you're the greatest of all the kings. And so that means you have to be compared to other kings and honestly have a better reputation, a better resume than all the other ones. So we began 2 weeks ago with talking about King Saul. And King Saul was the first king of Israel. And by and large, he had a good relationship with God. But his problem ultimately was that when it was time to show obedience to God, he failed. Right? When push came to shove, he had a real problem with being obedient. And because of his continued disobedience to God, right? God, through the prophet Samuel, says, hey, Saul, love you, man, but if you had just been obedient, you would have remained as king of Israel. But because you're disobedient, you're going to be replaced. And so we saw how Saul's disobedience brought about defeat and destruction, not just to the people as they were fighting different battles, but also to himself and his kingship. And so tonight, we'll still be in 1 Samuel. So if you have a Bible, flip over to 1 Samuel. It's before 2 Samuel, just in case you're curious. But go over to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. And as you flip there, you may recognize this story of the Bible. Is a very famous story, David and Goliath. And so we'll be looking at that tonight. And just to give you some background context of where we're at. Right, in chapter 15, where we finished 2 weeks ago, right, God tells Saul through Samuel, hey, you are going to be replaced as king by someone, quote, who is far greater than you. And then in chapter 16, Samuel goes to the house of Jesse, David's father. And there he finds Jesse and his three oldest sons. And he's asking, where is your other son? And he's referring to David, and David's out watching the sheep, and he calls David back in, and there Samuel anoints David as the new king, or the soon-to-be king of Israel. But Saul doesn't know this yet, and we'll see that unfold a little bit later. And then here, as we get into chapter 17, the Israelites, with King Saul, are getting ready to face the Philistines again in battle. And if you think back to chapter 14 and 15, they were fighting the Philistines there. And that was where Saul was disobedient. They ended up losing. But then they go back and win. And here they are a third time, getting ready, best 2 out of 3, with the Philistines in a place called the Valley of Elah. And so that's where we're going to pick up. So if you have your Bible, 1 Samuel 17, we're going to read starting out verses 2 through 11. 1 Samuel 17, 2 through 11. Hey, Wesley, it's not working again, so you're going to have to click for me. So here we go. 1 Samuel 17. Hello. Yeah, that was Jesus. Yikes. All right, 1 Samuel 17. I don't think he's telling us not to read his word. All right, 1 Samuel 17, 2 through 11. Here's what it says. Saul countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with the valley between them. Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and as thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor-bearer walked ahead of him carrying a shield. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. "Why are you all coming out to fight?" he called. "I am the Philistine champion, but you are only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. So first thing that we see here, if you're taking notes, as we look at 1 Samuel 17, 2 through 11, is that fear cripples our calling. First thing we see here is that fear cripples our calling. All right, so let's remember here the promises that God had given to the Israelites. All right, we talked about this 2 weeks ago. That God had promised the Israelites through Moses and Joshua as they went into the promised land, that if they would remain faithful to God, that God would protect them, provide for them, and ultimately give them victory in battle. So God has promised them, based on their faithfulness, that he would protect them. And we saw what happens when they were unfaithful, right? They lose the battles, right? And we see that in 1 Samuel 15. But here, what I noticed when I was reading this is there's no mention here that the Israelites have been unfaithful again. Right? At the end of 15, right, God, through Samuel, says, "Look, you've messed up, but I'll continue to work through you. You're my people." The promise stays intact. Even though they were disobedient, the promise stays intact. So here, we would think that even though Goliath has come out with the Philistines, that because they're remaining faithful, and there's nothing that says they're being unfaithful again, that they would be able to win this battle. But the Israelites, as we kind of start to see, they're not thinking about how they're going to win. Right? The Israelites are likely remembering how they lost a previous battle to the Philistines. Right? 2 battles ago, they lost. And now, all of a sudden, here comes this like super warrior coming out who's way taller than all of them, probably about 4 or 5 feet taller than them. Coming out, all decked out, wanting to one-on-one. And so they're terrified. They're not thinking about the promises of God. They're not thinking about how God had called them to be his people, and by calling them to be his people, promised them victory and protection. They're not thinking about the promise. They're not thinking about their calling because fear crippled their calling. Fear completely crippled it. Right? Their fear caused them to forget the promises of God. Their fear causes them to forget that they were called by God and will be protected by God. Their fear makes them focus on their past failures instead of God's work in the present. Their fear makes them feel insecure. Their fear prohibits their faith. Their fear prohibits their faith. It completely stops them from being able to have faith in God. If they were having faith in God, they wouldn't be, as verse 11 says, terrified and deeply shaken. If they were remembering the promise through faith that God had given them, they would feel secure. And would feel secure in who God has called them to be. And they would be remembering the promises. They would be having faith, but their fear prohibits their faith. And I think a lot of times we can resemble the Israelites, or we can identify with them on this. Right? God has made us promises. Right? As his people, as believers in Christ, we have been given certain promises. As we are called to be his people, we receive those promises. But when we face a battle or we face a struggle, we retreat in fear because we forget the promises of God. We forget. Now here's the thing that a lot of times I think that we miss is that God never promised that we won't have battles. God never promises you that you're not going to face a struggle. And a lot of times what happens is when we face that struggle, we feel like in our calling, as God calls us, it should just be this easy walk as we follow God. But he says it's going to be hard. He actually promises struggle, that you will face struggles. But the promise he makes is that you will overcome the battle, that you will overcome the struggle through faith. It's the same, God gives us the same promise that he gave the Israelites thousands of years ago. It's the same promise. And the same promise requires the same action. It's faith. And without faith, we cannot step out and follow God and receive the promises. We cannot find victory in our struggles. We can't overcome our struggles if we're not willing to have faith in God to provide us what we need to overcome it. When we are afraid of our struggles, it prohibits our faith. When we live in fear instead of by faith, it prohibits us from not only receiving the promises that God has given to us and promised us, but it prohibits us from being the people that God has called us to be. I can remember my sophomore year of college. It was right as I was getting ready to move down here, and I was considering one of two things. I was considering either applying for an internship outside of Huntsville, Alabama, where I grew up, or I was going to reapply for another internship at the church I grew up at. I just finished one after my freshman year of college, and honestly, it seemed really comfortable for me to go back again. And I decided that the way God was calling me was to step out of my comfort zone. And as I got accepted for an internship here at this church, I began, as time got closer, to be anxious. Maybe I wasn't fearful, but I was afraid and had anxiety about the things I didn't know. Where am I going to live? Because it was like a week out, and I still hadn't been told where I was going to stay all summer. And in my mind, I'm picturing having to say, well, I'll just sleep on the couches at the church, or I don't know. It was really uncertain, and I'm someone who likes structure. I like a schedule, and I like to know what's going to happen. And so for me, I became insecure in knowing what God had called me to do. I was insecure. I was anxious in that calling. And I can just tell you right now that if I had given into that fear and allowed that fear to control my actions instead of my faith to control my actions, I wouldn't even be standing on this stage today. I wouldn't be. Because my fear in that instance would have prohibited me from having faith and thus receiving the promises of God and stepping into who he had called me and where he was calling me to be. And the same thing is happening here with the Israelites. Fear cripples our calling. And when faced with going to the cross, Christ showed a lot of faith. He showed a lot of faith in God. And David, we'll see, shows great faith too. And the Israelites at times show great faith, but Jesus ultimately shows us a great example of, quote unquote, choosing faith over fear. You've heard this saying before. Right? As he's going, he fully trusted the word of God and the promises of God, that God would be with him, that God had an ultimate plan for his suffering, and that God would use his suffering for good. Jesus trusted in the word and promises of God. And he didn't allow fear to cripple who God was calling him to be. And didn't allow fear to cripple what God was calling him to do. And the Israelites missed this a lot. And as they're getting ready to face the Philistines, they completely miss this. And they're trembling, they're shaking. They don't even want to go out and face this guy. Even though the promise of God that had been given to them, and God had proven this promise, is that, hey, if you'll have faith, if you'll walk with me, it doesn't matter who faces you. It doesn't matter what struggle you face. You'll overcome it. But they forget it because they're living in fear. I want you to look again at 1 Samuel 17. We're going to continue in verse 12 through verse 31. We're going to read all of chapter 17 tonight. So 1 Samuel 17, starting in verse 12 through 31. It's hot. Now David was the son of a man named Jesse, an Ephrathite from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. Jesse was an old man at that time, and he had 8 sons. Jesse's 3 oldest sons, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shimea, had already joined Saul's army to fight the Philistines. David was the youngest son. David's 3 oldest brothers stayed with Saul's army, but David went back and forth so he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem. For 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. One day, Jesse said to David, "Take this basket of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread, and carry them quickly to your brothers, and give them these 10 cuts of cheese to their captain. See how your brothers are getting along, and bring back a report on how they are doing." David's brothers were with Saul and the Israelite army at the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts, as Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield, with shouts and battle cries. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to their ranks to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. Then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. "Have you seen the giant?" the men asked. "He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes." David asked the soldiers standing nearby, "What will a man get for killing the Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyways, that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" And these men gave David the same reply. They said, "Yes, that is the reward for killing him." But when David's oldest brother Eliab heard David talking to the men, he was angry. "What are you doing around here anyways?" he demanded. "What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle." "What have I done now?" David replied. "I was only asking a question." He walked over to some of the others and asked them the same thing and received the same answer. Then David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. Now, just as a side note, one of my good friends, some of you know him, Stephen Spivey, he went over to Israel a couple years ago and actually went to the valley of Elah. And I have this sitting on my bookcase, and so afterwards, if you want to look at this, this is one of the rocks from the valley where David would have fought Goliath. So if you want to see a similar rock that maybe perhaps David slung at Goliath, I'll keep this up here at the end for you to look at. But before we even look further into this chapter, I want us to establish that God calls servants. God calls servants. Right? When we look back at the previous chapters leading up to chapter 17, and we look at what David is doing when he is anointed king, where do we find David? Where did Samuel find David? Right? Samuel shows up, and there's a party at Jesse's house, and who's not there? David is not there. He's out in the field serving his family, keeping the sheep. Right? And then in chapter 16, right, after he's been anointed king, he goes and he serves King Saul in his court. And we find that that David is giving King Saul advice. And Saul has no idea that David has been anointed as the soon-to-be king who's going to replace King Saul. But David is serving King Saul. And now here in chapter 17, we find David again serving his family by taking food to the battlefield for his brothers and taking a report back to his dad so he doesn't have to be anxious about his sons. And what we see is God has called David. But he's called David because David is a servant. And God calls servants. Now, our callings, right? We talk about this. What has God called you to do? Right? The purpose that God gives each and every one of us, each and every one of you, God has given you a purpose. Whether you realize it or not, or think he has, or don't think he has. God has given you a purpose. But a lot of times we think that these purposes that God, these callings that God has given us are for our fulfillment. Right? To feel like we have a place in the world. Right? To fulfill our identity. But in all reality, the purposes and callings that God has given us, they are a position of service to God. Your calling that God has given you, that God will lead you into, is not a position of fulfillment for yourself. It's a position of service to God. And it's for God's glory, not yours. And I think a lot of times that's where we miss it. That's where we miss the mark. And a lot of times we sit here wondering what our purpose is, what our calling is, because we're seeking personal fulfillment. And we're unable to figure it out. And I would argue that we're unable to figure it out because we're not willing to serve God. We're not seeking our calling and purpose to serve God. We're seeking it for our own personal identity and fulfillment. And if our callings are ultimately a service position to God, why would we ever be allowed to step into that calling if we're not willing to use it to serve God as he intends for it? What we see with David is this, that God purposefully positions. That's the next thing on your notes. God purposefully positions. And we look at David. He's serving when Samuel anoints him, and then where does he get positioned after he's anointed? At the right hand of the king. Giving the king advice. God is preparing David. He's not just going to throw him into his calling. He didn't just go get anointed in the field while he's keeping the sheep and get promoted into the palace. He transitioned. God purposely positioned David each step of the way. And what we look at here as David is serving his brothers, where is he again? He's right next to the king. And the questions that he's asking make it to the king. And that is what allows that question where God has David serving, because David is willing to serve where God is leading him to serve. God uses his acts of service to position him exactly where he needs to Because what we're going to see is that David, his question about the reward, Saul's going to take David and throw him out there, thinking it probably is some joke, but no one else will do it. But as he goes and he kills Goliath, he wins the Israelite people over. He wins the Israelite people over, and they start saying, to David, his 10,000s. And Saul begins to get really angry, because now the people are looking to David instead of looking to Saul. But what's happening here is the transition is taking place. He's now won the people over so that when he becomes king, they're already looking to him. They're not looking to the person that he's replacing. That each step that David took, each act of service, God purposely positioned him. Another example in the Old Testament that we see of this, a really good one, is Joseph. And you may be familiar with this word, but essentially Joseph's brothers sold him as a servant to Egypt. Right? And Joseph goes to Egypt and ends up serving the Pharaoh and the king. And what we see there is, as a famine strikes, who is now in charge of handing out the food? Joseph is. And who comes along? His brothers. And God perfectly positioned and purposely positioned Joseph. What we see with anyone in Scripture who is serving God in their calling is that God has them right where they're at for a specific reason, because he's purposely positioned them. A lot of times when we begin to understand where God is leading us to serve, what God is calling us to do, we want to jump right in. We want to get straight to the top. We don't want to serve along the way. But what we see with this, with David, is that God is not going to allow you to step into a position that you cannot handle. And so a lot of times we don't just get to go straight to the top because we can't handle what's at the top. If David had been thrown into the palace, he would have been a terrible king. David would have failed. He wasn't mature enough. He hadn't won the people over. And God had things that he needed to prepare him for. And God prepared him along the way. What we see is that David served small before he served big. He served small before he served big. And God didn't allow David to take on more than he could handle. God wants to see your obedience. It's a service position. Why did God not allow Saul to continue? Because he couldn't be obedient. And for David, God wanted to see that he could be obedient in the shepherd field before being obedient in the palace. When we look at Luke chapter 16, verse 10, flip over there if you have your Bible. It's not going to be on the screen. Luke chapter 16, verse 10. Let me read this to you. Here's what it says. This is Jesus talking. If you are faithful in the little things, you will be faithful in the large ones. But if you are dishonest in the little things, you won't be honest with greater responsibilities. What Jesus communicates there to the people that he's speaking to is, look, you have to be obedient with the small things first. God will call you. God will give you your purpose. But you're not going to go straight to the top first. You're going to have to prove that you'll be obedient with the position God has given you now before you can grow up into the position God is giving you in the future. Here's the thing. Yeah, you have an overall purpose that as you get older that you'll step into, but what are you doing right now to prepare for that? Because I'm just going to tell you right now, every day that you are not serving God and preparing for what God is calling you into is another day you delay your calling. It's another day you delay your calling. And you may not know what your calling is right now, but what are you doing to serve God? What are you doing to to serve God because your lack of service right now is delaying the time frame in which God allows you to step into your purpose. You have to show right now that you can be faithful with the small things that God has given you. You have to be faithful to show that when you're at school, you can set a good example for Christ. Because if you're not willing to do it in school, when it's not popular, why would we ever think you're going to do that in the world where it's really not popular? Why would we? Not all of you are going to be youth pastors or missionaries or whatever. Some of you may work in a business. You may go work for a corporate business where you're not allowed to speak your faith. And if you do, you don't get the promotion. But what's more important to you? And right now, what is more important in the school is sharing your faith or the popularity. Because if you're choosing popularity over your faith right now, you're going to choose the promotion over your faith later. Where are you at right now? You have a position that you've been placed in. So how are you serving God in your position now? Because you won't take that next step until you're serving God where you're at now. The key to stepping into our purpose is being a servant. And David, for all intents and purposes, he was a pretty good example of what it looks like to be a servant for God in our calling and to serve God with our calling. But when we look at Jesus, right, and all of this, we're comparing it to Jesus. Jesus took it a step further, right? When we talk about the Son of God, Jesus, who gave up the privileges that came with being God to be a man and to ultimately go suffer and die on a cross, right? He was willing to serve. He was willing to give up anything he had to serve. We see Jesus for 40 days resisting temptation in the desert. For 40 days he resists temptation in the desert. He served God in those days on a small scale. And then what we see is when he's faced with denouncing that he's the Son of God to escape crucifixion, he continues to serve God. Right? When it was just him and Satan in the desert, sure, he could, maybe no one else would have known. But before all the people, when the religious leaders are calling him a blasphemer, a liar, saying that he's lying about being the Son of God and that they're going to crucify him because of that, he continues to serve God. He served small before he served big. And he served by giving up everything, including his life. And God called Jesus to do what he did and be who he was. So again, on a large level, we see that God calls servants. The last piece of scripture I want us to look at tonight is 1 Samuel 17, 32 through 58. Let's look at this. Starting in verse 32. It says, "Don't worry about the Philistines," David told Saul. "I will go fight him." "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. "There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You are only a boy, and he seems to have been a man of war since his youth." But David persisted. "I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats," he said. "When a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death." David he's a thug. "I have done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to the pagan Philistine too. For he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine." Saul finally consented. All right, go ahead. And may the Lord be with you. Then Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet, and a coat of mail. David put it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things before. I can't go in these, he protested to Saul. I'm not used to them. So David took them off again. He picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them in his shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and a sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Goliath walked out towards David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy. Am I a dog, he roared at David, that you came at me with a stick? And he cursed David by the names of his gods. Come over here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals, Goliath yelled. David replied to the Philistine, you come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head. And then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals. The whole world will know that there is a God in Israel, and everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. Reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. Then David ran over to pull Goliath's sword from his sheath, and David used it to kill him and cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah gave a great shout of triumph and rushed after the Philistines, chasing them as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. The bodies of the dead and wounded Philistines were strewn all along the road to Sharim, as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the Israelite army returned and plundered the deserted Philistine camp. David took the Philistine's head to Jerusalem, but he stored the man's armor in his own tent. As Saul watched David go out to fight the Philistine, he asked Abner, the commander of his army, Abner, whose son is this young man? I really don't know, Abner declared. We'll find out who he is, the king told him. As soon as David returned from killing Goliath, Abner brought him to Saul with the Philistine's head still in his hand. Tell me about your father, young man, Saul said. And David replied, his name is Jesse, and we live in Bethlehem. All right, so David trusts in the promises of God. And he goes to Saul and he says, look, I will take him on. Why are you afraid of the Philistines? God has given you the promise. And God has, through his promise, said that he will protect you if you'll have faith. If you'll have faith. So he goes out and he ends up, and he tells Goliath to his face, look, I'm not going to win because I'm bigger than you. I'm going to win because I've got God on my side, and I have faith that he is a man, a God who will keep his promises to his people. Here's what we see, is that we need to have confidence in our calling. You need to have confidence in your calling. David had confidence in his calling. David had swag. I asked a couple of students yesterday. I was telling them just how impressed I was with the way that David just really carried himself. Just straight up to the king and said, look, you're being dumb. Go fight the guy. Like, we have nothing to worry about. And so I asked them to put this in Gen Z language for me. And here's what they said. Okay? Here are the responses I got. I was told David was dripping, no cap. Here's the one I really don't understand. They said David knew he was the dog, no kizzy. Whatever kizzy means, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Look, all I know is that David had confidence confidence in God's calling. David had extreme confidence. He had extreme faith that the Lord would be faithful and provide just as he said he would, just as he had promised. And here's what David knew. David knew that God equips the call. That God equips the call. So many times, I've doubted myself many times for this same reason, but I hear students say this a lot too, and just people in general say this a lot. This is a thing for everyone. That we feel that we are disqualified from our calling. Or that we can't do what God is calling us to do. Because we don't feel that we're equipped. That we don't have what it takes. We disqualify ourselves because we don't think we're good enough to do what God may be calling us to do. Yeah, put that next slide up. So, it's hard to read this. I know, the screen. We're working on getting these TVs fixed. So, my sophomore year of college, I had to take a strengths test. It's called the Strengths Finders test. And essentially what it is like 120 some questions that you answer, and it essentially tells you like your top 5 strengths. My sophomore year of college, my top 5 were adaptability, relator, individualization, includer, and arranger. I have no idea what those really mean. I have no idea how those would help me. But flip to the next slide. I took this last week. Okay? Took the same test last week. My top 5 strengths came out to be strategic, relator, responsibility, belief, communication. And what we see, like all 5 of these things, I see playing into exactly what God has called me to do. The other 5 things, I don't really see it at all. The only one that carried over was relator, being able to relate to people. But all the other ones, especially communication, what I'm doing right now, communicating the Word of God. And so what I have seen play out in my life is that where I didn't feel equipped or didn't feel like I had the strengths to do what God was calling me to do, God equipped me for my calling. And it may not happen overnight. It'll happen over years. But as you step into the calling that God has for you, He equips you for your calling. No, you're not going to be equipped for your calling right off the bat when He calls you. Most likely not. But God doesn't call the equipped. He doesn't call the qualified. He equips the called. He will equip you because He called you. He won't call you because you're qualified. There's a big difference there. And when we understand that we don't have to have the strengths to step into what God is calling us to do, the purpose that God has for us, then we're free from that. And we don't have to disqualify ourselves. We have to have faith that God will provide the strength that we need to overcome struggles, but also have faith that He will provide the strengths that we need to walk the life that He has called us to. Remember that He purposefully positions. You are where you are for a reason. God will use you where you're at. If you will serve where you're at, God will continue to purposely position you along the way. And as He purposely positions you, He will equip you for your calling. Not only did David trust God in his calling, not only did David trust God in his calling, but he stayed true to his calling. He stayed true to his calling. I want to again look at verses 38 and 39. You don't have to put it on the screen. Just listen to this again. Verses 38 and 39 says, Then Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet, and a coat of mail. Saul gives David Saul's armor. Okay? Then Saul gives it to David. David puts it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things. I can't go in these, he protested to Saul. I'm not used to them. So he took them off. He took them off. David stayed true to who he was. He wasn't trying to be someone he wasn't. Someone who God hadn't called him to be. At that time, who was David? David was a shepherd. He wasn't a warrior. Where had God positioned him? He's in the field with the sheep. He's not at the battlefield. That's not where God had positioned him. And so he stayed true to who he was. What we see is that we must live in our calling. You must live in your calling, not somebody else's. You cannot look at what someone else is doing, at who God has called someone else to be, and go, I want to be that. I want to do that. And then pursue that. Because that doesn't get you to God's purpose for you. Service does. Serving God does. When we pursue what we want to do, we're not necessarily pursuing what God wants us to do. And David understood this, that he had to live in his calling. We were not made to walk in someone else's shoes. You were made to walk in your shoes, and only yours. You were made for your purpose, not someone else's. God is equipping you for your calling, not someone else's. So you have to stay true to who God is calling you to be. And again, David sets a great example of this. But again and again, we see it really playing out in the life of Jesus. And as we look at the life of Jesus, we see that Jesus trusted God for strength to serve him as God had called him. Right? As Jesus is going to the cross in the Garden of Gethsemane, he asked God for strength to serve God, to fulfill what God had called him to do. He's not relying on himself. He's relying on the Father. He's saying, I don't have the strength. I need your strength. I need you to equip me for this. He stayed true to his calling as the Son of God. Jesus was not called to be the Father. Jesus was called to be the Son. And there's a submission that goes with that. We see over and over again in Philippians 2:6. Here's what Philippians 2:6 says. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. He knew who God was calling him to be. He didn't try to be the Father. He was content with living as the Son and serving God as the Son. He was content with consistently submitting to the authority of God. What we see is that while David, he does a great example of showing us what it truly means to faithfully live in our callings, Jesus perfects that example. He perfects that example. And David, by and large, yes, he as we'll continue to see, he's a very good king. David is a very good king, and he's very faithful to God as a king, but he is by no means perfect. And we will continue this series next week by looking at some of the shortcomings that David had, and how he messed up, and what we can learn from that. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this evening. I thank you for your word. I thank you for the way that your word challenges us. Lord, I thank you that you love us to the point that you define a purpose for us. And Lord, a lot of times we search for our purpose or our calling for our own fulfillment and identity, but Lord, you have designed that to be a position of service to you. And so, Lord, where we're at right now, Lord, I pray that you would help us identify how we can serve you where you have us. Or that we wouldn't look to the future, but we would be content with the present and serve you here and not be focused on how we can serve you in the future. Lord, you are leading us into to a greater calling to serve you. But Lord, help us not miss where you're calling us right now, what you're calling us to do with the position we have right now. Lord, these students, they have a position, they have a platform, they have influence. Or there are people around them each and every day as they walk through the halls of their school, or that need to know your name, need to know your love, need to know your truth. Lord, help them where they're at right now to find ways to serve you. And as they do, Lord, reveal to them the purpose that you have for them. Lord, you are a good God. You are a faithful God. And Lord, sometimes we run in fear because we don't remember your promises. We see the battle, we see the struggles, and we're afraid. And Lord, sometimes it seems easier when we're afraid just to take matters into our own hands. But Lord, help us in times of trouble, in times of suffering, when we're faced with a difficult situation. Lord, help us to remember your promises. Lord, I need to remember your promises. Your promise that you will always love us. Your promise that even when we're walking through a difficult situation, Lord, you will work to bring good out of it. But that you will ultimately protect us. Even as we walk through a world that is full of sin and suffering, Lord, you promise us by faith salvation eternally with you. Lord, help us to keep our eyes focused on the promise. Help us to keep our eyes focused on our faith and our faith in Christ. Lord, I thank you for these students. I thank you for the love that you do have for them. I pray that you would speak to them the way that they need to hear you. Lord, if they don't know your love and they need to hear from you the love that you have for them, I pray that you would show that to them. Lord, I know there are people in this room who doubt you, who are mad at you. Lord, I pray that you would just work in their lives in a way that's undeniable, in a way that speaks clearly, in a way that speaks truth to the lies that maybe they have believed. Lord, as we go through the rest of this evening, I pray that you would challenge us to go deeper. Challenge us to live as servants for you in all that we do and say. And I pray that you would touch our hearts, Lord, as we worship in this next song and speak to us as we go into groups. It's your name we pray. Amen. And during this next song, as the band is singing, started doing this again the past couple weeks. We got some slips of paper back there at the prayer wall. And I would encourage you, don't stay seated during this song. Right? This is a time for you, an intentional time, a purposeful time for you to go before God and tell him what's on your heart. Tell him what's on your mind. Tell him the struggles that you're facing or the struggle someone close to you is facing. This time can be about your needs or it can be about the needs of someone else. Whatever you feel led to go before God in prayer. But take a pen and take a piece of paper and lightly tack it to the wall. Some of y'all jam those things in. I have to go get a pair of pliers and pull them out. Literally. Stick it to the prayer wall. I'm telling you, pray for these every week. And it amazes me the honesty that y'all have in your prayers. And it amazes me some of the struggles that you're facing. And I want you to know you're being prayed for in those. And I pray for all of you each week, but it is incredibly helpful. Honestly, it's a huge blessing to me to be able to pray for you exactly how you need prayer. You don't have to write your name on the paper, but if you do, it helps me pray for you by name. It helps me to know who is struggling or what you need prayer for so that I can continue to pray for them. next song, don't stay seated. Go before the Lord in prayer. Write your request on the paper, tack it to the wall, and then worship. Don't sit down. Don't sit down. Stand and worship the Lord.
sacrifice. Oh, use me how you want to, God, and have your throne within my heart. Lord, I thank you for this night. I just thank you for just being in this room with us. And Lord, I pray that we will be open and available for you, Lord, so that we can see our calling, so that we don't just point at someone and say, I want that. But we look at you and we say, Lord, have your will be done in my life. Do what you want with me, Lord. Because you know us better than we know ourselves. Lord, you know the desires of our heart. So I pray that we'll just have faith in you, that we'll trust you. Even when it can be scary and